how would you define conservatism?
Hmm. Well, conservatism is one of those words that means many things to many people. I mean, to me, the idea of conservatism is basically to keep things as they are. um, it's a support for the status quo. It's a fear of innovation and change.
How would you define liberalism?
Now, liberalism, is even more difficult to define than conservatism because liberalism, has been adopted by so many different kinds of people. But in general, thinking of the United States, liberalism is defined as the, idea that the government should play an active role in bringing about certain kinds of reform which are egalitarian reform. So that is the liberal idea in the United States has been, that the government should play some role in guaranteeing to large numbers of the American people sort of basic economic rights and basic political rights, even if this requires departing from the status quo. I label myself as a radical, not as a liberal. That is, generally liberals want to operate within the existing social order. A liberal in the United States usually believes in capitalism, believes in more benign capitalism. Liberalism will go along with an expansionist foreign policy, even with war, and maybe will criticize the wars conducted, or will distinguish between good wars, bad wars, just wars, unjust wars. A radical will question the very idea of war.
Who are some of the most important radicals that people should know about in American history?
Well, I think the most important radicals were, those farmer rebels of the Revolutionary period, like the Shays Rebellion people. The radicals were the anti-slavery people who broke the law, committed civil disobedience, violated the Fugitive Slave Act, broke into courthouses and police stations to rescue slaves who had escaped and who were now being brought back to custody. The radicals of the late 19th century were the populists who organized the farmers and who were opposed to the big railroads and the corporations. The radicals were the labor leaders like Eugene Debs, who organized strikes. And at the turn of the century, the radicals were organized now into the Socialist Party, into the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And that was a high point of radicalism. But the Socialist Party at that time, included people, not only people like Eugene Debs, included Helen Keller, Jack London, Upton Sinclair, people who were important in the arts and important in the culture. So the radicals, radicals of the early part of the 20th century were the socialists and the Wobblies, the IWW. The radicals of the 30s were, the Communist Party was in its ascendancy in the 30s and 40s. But there were radicals who were not members of the Communist Party, but who opposed capitalism. There were socialists, there were Trotskyists, and there were many different kinds of radicals. And then in the post-war period, in the Cold War period, when the Communist Party was sort of being decimated by the government, the radicals were pacifists very often who opposed the Cold War and who committed acts of civil disobedience against the nuclear weapons. And then radicalism really came into its own in this country in the 1960s. The radicalism in the civil rights movement, Stokely Carmichael was a radical. Many people in the civil rights movement were radicals without knowing it. That is, they were very deeply opposed to the American system, but they were never looked upon as radicals, except maybe by the FBI. I mean, Martin Luther King is an example. He never talked of himself as a radical or as a socialist, but he actually was opposed to capitalism. And J. Edgar Hoover probably understood this, but J. Edgar Hoover saw Martin Luther King Jr. as a dangerous radical. Malcolm X was a radical, and he did not accept what he considered was inadequate liberal measures for racial desegregation, which would basically leave black people still economically poor. And during the Vietnam War, radicalism flourished again, and not everybody who was against the Vietnam War was a radical, but I would say the war increased the number of radicals.
Where do you think the future holds for the political situation in the United States? Where does a radical turn?
Oh, I wish I knew. Although I do believe there will be a turn. I believe that capitalism is proving itself incapable of handling this enormous economic system in a just and rational way. I mean, it is already failing in so many ways. Here we are, the wealthiest country in the world by far, and yet we have several million homeless people. Yet we have all these people who do not have medical care. We have a middle class which is very nervous, uncertain of its future. And if the country keeps following the policies that we are now seeing, that is huge amounts of the wealth of the country going to the military establishment, and less money going to education and health and childcare and so on, I believe that more and more people are going to become alienated from the government, and alienated from the major parties if those major parties continue to support these policies.
What if they just stay home, though, and they don't vote, and then, where's the anger?
Well, the anger is mostly inside. The anger is mostly internal. And anger is generally not expressed by people. Even people who are angry, they don't act out that anger until they see that it might work, until they see an opportunity. People are practical. They're not going to rush out into the streets and shout if they think it's futile and if they think it'll be dangerous for them. Now you can look at the situation in the South. Were black people angry? Yes, they were angry for a long time. And if you looked at them for a long period of time, you say, well, where is their anger? There's no great movement of black people in the South. Well, they didn't see an opening. They didn't see a possibility of using their anger without committing suicide. When the opportunity came, when the first breakthroughs came, when the Montgomery bus boycott took place and it was successful, and people began to gather courage, and when they saw that the sit-ins in Greensboro in 1960 were then accompanied by sit-ins all over the South, well, people began to gain more confidence. And that's what it takes. I mean, the anger is there. The understanding is there. I believe, for instance, that right now among Americans, there is actually a very strong class consciousness. When they take surveys and ask people in the United States, do you believe that a small group of rich people run the country? 80% will say yes. But they don't know what to do about that. There's no movement they can join in order to deal with that. And so they keep quiet, and they seem to be passive and accepting. But there's an anger there below the surface that I think at some point, and I don't know when that point will be, will emerge. And then we'll have a new great social movement in this country, and maybe we'll have some change.